Welcome to Module 2 of the FSSC 22000 Version 7 Transition Series, Scheme Requirement Part 2, Requirements for Organizations to be Audited. In this module, we move beyond the broad overview of the scheme and begin examining the requirements that directly affect day-to-day operations inside a certified organization. This is where the transition becomes highly practical, because these clauses influence procedures, records, competence, monitoring, supplier control, verification, and internal audit preparation. As we go through this section, we will look at what has changed, why the changes matter, and how your organization should interpret them during implementation. Some updates are editorial and only require careful wording review, while others are operationally significant and may require changes to procedures, responsibilities, evidence, and training. By the end of this module, you should be able to see the difference between a simple clause adjustment and a change that affects the whole management system. The purpose of this presentation is not only to explain the version 7 requirements, but also to help your team think like auditors and system owners. That means identifying what evidence will be expected, where gaps may appear, and how to prepare confidently for the transition audit. Let us start with the foundation: general requirements and prerequisite programs. This is one of the most important parts of the scheme because PRPs form the operational base of food safety management. If the PRPs are weak, the rest of the system becomes harder to maintain, even if the documented procedures look complete on paper. In version 6, organizations often referred to the ISO TS 22002-X series or other specified PRP standards, and in some cases, BSI PAS 221 was also part of the framework. Version 7 tightens the structure by moving fully to the ISO 22002-X series referenced in Part 1, Table 1. That means the old references should no longer remain in manuals, audit checklists, SOPs, or training slides. This is not just a terminology update. It is a shift toward a more harmonized structure that helps align all food chain categories with a common prerequisite program logic. For organizations, the practical message is simple. Review every place where PRP references appear and make sure your documentation now points to the correct version 7 structure. Another important update is the clarification of scheme changes and interpretation. The wording has been shortened, but the responsibility remains clear. Certified organizations and certification bodies must still follow official BOS decisions and interpretation articles. In other words, organizations should not rely on informal assumptions when interpreting requirements. The scheme's formal interpretation remains the reference point. Version 7 also updates the ISO 22000 reference by adding the phrase, including any amendments issued by ISO. This is a small textual change, but it matters for future-proofing. It means that if ISO issues amendments to the base standard, they are automatically included within the scheme reference. Organizations should therefore keep their clause mapping, standards register, and cross-reference documents current. The most important statement in this section is the mandatory application of the ISO 22002-X series for PRPs. In version 6, the language could still point to a mix of ISO TS and PAS sources. In version 7, that flexibility is gone. The scheme now expects the ISO 22002-X series to be the foundation for prerequisite programs, except for the FII category. This makes compliance clearer, but it also makes outdated references a likely source of nonconformity if they are not updated promptly. Now let us move into services, procurement, specifications, and printed materials. These areas may look administrative at first glance, but in practice, they have a direct influence on food safety control. The first major update is in laboratory analysis. Version 7 is more explicit that labs used for parameters critical to food safety shall comply with the applicable ISO/IEC 17025 requirements. This is a strong reinforcement of laboratory competence. The practical meaning is that testing is not just about getting a result, it is about trust in the result. If a test is being used to support a food safety decision, then the competence of the laboratory must be demonstrated. Organizations should therefore review their external lab approval process, internal testing records, and supplier evaluation criteria to ensure the correct competence expectations are in place. Emergency procurement is another area of change. In version 6, the requirement applied to categories C, D, I, F22, G, and K. In version 7, category BIII has been added. That means organizations in this new scope must also have a formal emergency procurement process. Emergency procurement is often a weak point because it is used under pressure when normal sourcing is unavailable. That is exactly why the scheme pays attention to it. The organization must be able to show that even urgent purchasing decisions are controlled, approved, and documented. This includes temporary suppliers, substitute materials, and situations where a standard procurement route cannot be followed. The expectation is not to eliminate emergency purchasing, but to manage it with discipline. The procurement clause for animals, fish, and seafood has also been updated to reference ISO 22002-1:2025 Clause 10 rather than the older 2009 clause. This means audit checklists and supplier control references should be revised immediately. If your internal documentation still cites the older clause number, that mismatch should be corrected before the transition audit. Specifications have also become more specific. BII is now included in the scope, and where legislation is absent, food safety-related microbiological, physical, chemical, and allergenic specifications must be based on appropriate scientific principles. This is a very important point because it makes scientific justification part of the requirement itself. Organizations can no longer rely on habit or industry practice alone when formal legal limits are not available. Finally, printed materials are now covered based on the printing activity rather than only by category. In version 6, this requirement mainly applied to category 1. In version 7, any organization that prints labels or other materials may be affected. This is especially relevant for manufacturers that print labels internally because label control is directly connected to product identification, allergen communication, and legal compliance. If labels are printed on-site, the process must be controlled as a food safety-related activity. Version 7 continues to strengthen areas that protect the integrity of the food system, especially food defense and food fraud. Food defense requirements are now aligned to ISO 22002-100-2025, Clause 16.2, and the wording also adds explicit competence ownership. This means the organization must show not only that food defense controls exist, but also that responsible personnel understand them and can implement them effectively. Food defense is about intentional harm. That includes vulnerability to malicious acts, sabotage, tampering, and unauthorized access. The expectation in version 7 is that food defense should not sit only in a policy file. It must be embedded in the food safety management system and supported by competent ownership. This makes accountability much more visible. Food fraud mitigation is similarly strengthened and aligned to ISO 22002-100-2025, Clause 16.3. Here, the organization must develop a vulnerability assessment and mitigation plan through competent personnel, and that plan must be supported by FSMS integration. In practice, this means food fraud must be managed as a living risk, not as a one-time checklist exercise. For many organizations, fraud mitigation is one of the most strategic parts of the system because it links procurement, supplier approval, market intelligence, and specification control. The update in version 7 reinforces that fraud prevention is a structured management responsibility, not a passive compliance item. Allergen management has also been refined. Category D previously had a condition where the clause could be marked not applicable if there was no allergen legislation for animal feed. Version 7 extends that conditional wording to pet food in Category C as well. This is a subtle but important clarification because allergen expectations are highly dependent on the product type and legal context. Environmental monitoring has been clarified mainly in terminology, changing the wording from food chain categories to food chain subcategories for B3, C, I, and K. This is not a major operational change, but it improves precision. The message here is that version 7 is increasingly focused on accurate category definition and clearer applicability statements. One of the strongest messages in version 7 is that food safety and quality culture must go beyond posters, slogans, and policy statements. In version 6, senior management was required to establish culture objectives, supported by a documented plan, targets, and timelines. Version 7 keeps that expectation, but adds two important elements: sufficient resource provision and demonstrable commitment from all personnel to production and safe handling of food. This is a meaningful shift because it moves culture from a leadership document to an organization-wide behavior requirement. It is no longer enough to say that culture exists. The organization must show evidence of action, involvement, and shared responsibility. That could include training records, behavioral observations, internal campaigns, leadership walkthroughs, corrective action trends, and staff engagement evidence. The emphasis on resources is equally important. If management says food safety is a priority but does not allocate time, people, training, or equipment, the claim will not be credible. Version 7 expects resource support to be visible in practice. That may include staffing decisions, maintenance budgets, monitoring tools, testing support, or training time. The requirement for commitment from all personnel also raises the bar. Culture cannot be built by management alone. Operators, supervisors, maintenance staff, logistics teams, sanitation teams, and quality personnel all play a role. The scheme now expects that role to be visible and demonstrable. So, when preparing for audit, organizations should ask a simple question. Can we prove that culture is real, or only that it is written down? Version 7 clearly expects proof that culture is lived, measured, and supported every day. Transport, storage, warehousing, hazard control, and PRP verification have all been refined in version 7. The transport, storage, and warehousing clause has been updated with clearer terminology, and the old FI-specific item from BSI/PAS 221/2013 has been removed as the PRP structure has changed. This means SOP wording should be reviewed carefully so that it matches the current scheme language. The hazard control and cross-contamination clause is another area where the references have been updated. Older references to ISO TS 2202-1/2009 and ISO TS 2202-6/2016 are now replaced by ISO 2202-1/2025, Clause 12, and ISO 2202-6/2025, Clause 12. This is important because many organizations use clause references in their internal CCP studies, PRP procedures, audit tools, and training materials. All of those references should now be checked and corrected. PRP verification has also expanded. In version 6, the clause applied to BIIII, C, D, G, I, and K. In version 7, categories E and FI are added to the routine site inspection and PRP checks. This is operationally significant, especially for catering, food service, retail, and wholesale operations that may not previously have been treated with the same level of routine PRP verification. The practical impact is that more organizations will now need documented inspection schedules, verification records, and follow-up actions. If you operate in a service or retail environment, do not assume that PRP verification is only for manufacturing. Version 7 makes it clear that these categories must also demonstrate structured verification of their controls. Product design and development have also been narrowed in applicability. The production and shelf life trial requirement now applies specifically to BIIII, C, D, and K. This category-specific wording means organizations must not apply the clause blindly to every site. Instead, they should confirm whether the clause is applicable to their scope and then build the necessary evidence accordingly. Version 7 introduces a new and very important requirement for primary packaging design. This is a new clause, and it reflects the growing recognition that packaging is part of the food safety system, not just an industrial or marketing decision. Organizations designing primary packaging must now consider containment and protection, shelf life impact, food loss and waste reduction, and consumer communication. This is a major development because packaging decisions can directly affect product integrity, labeling clarity, spoilage risk, and consumer understanding. A poorly chosen primary package can allow contamination, reduce shelf life, or increase waste. A well-designed package, on the other hand, can protect the food, improve stability, and support responsible consumption. The requirement also emphasizes that food safety must not be negatively impacted. That means sustainability is important, but it cannot come at the expense of safety. The two must be balanced. This is a very modern interpretation of design responsibility, and organizations involved in packaging development should review their design review process, risk assessments, and supplier specifications accordingly. The other major change in this section is the Clause 2.5.14 swap. In version 6, this clause addressed health status for Category D, focusing on personnel health in feed production. In version 7, the same clause number now refers to traceability for subcategory C0, requiring traceability of all edible parts of the carcass until they are deemed fit for human consumption, including blood for human consumption. This is one of the most important warnings for learners and auditors. The same clause number does not always mean the same requirement. You must read the clause title, scope, and updated content carefully. If you assume version 6 meaning still applies, you may completely misunderstand the requirement. Version 7 makes traceability more explicit and more tightly defined for this subcategory. Food loss and waste have moved from a general policy expectation to a more measurable management requirement. In version 6, organizations were expected to have a documented policy and objectives. In version 7, those objectives must be supported by clear and measurable targets with defined timelines. That means policy alone is no longer enough. The organization must show a real reduction strategy with progress that can be tracked. This change reflects a wider global trend. Food loss and waste are no longer just sustainability topics. They are operational efficiency issues, cost issues, and reputational issues. A strong food safety system should reduce waste caused by process errors, poor storage, improper handling, or weak shelf life management. Communication has been editorially shortened, with the wording changing from certification body to CB. The core 3 working day notification requirement remains unchanged, so this is not a functional shift. It is mainly a wording update, and it can be mentioned briefly in the training. Multi-site requirements have also expanded. In version 6, the additional requirements applied to E, F, and G. In version 7, BIII has been added. This matters for plant handling and packhouse networks where multiple linked sites may function under one system but still need clear control, consistency, and governance. For organizations operating as a network, version 7 makes it even more important to define who owns which activities, how documents are controlled, and how changes are communicated across sites. Multi-site compliance is rarely only about location. It is about control across a system. The final change in this module relates to internal auditor training. Version 7 updates the wording so that internal auditor training now covers the relevant version of ISO 22000 linked to the scheme and the relevant sector-specific PRPs based on the ISO 22002-X series. This is important because auditors must understand not only the generic management system, but also the sector-specific prerequisites that support it. In practical terms, this means training records should be reviewed and updated. An internal auditor for a food manufacturing site will need a different technical depth from an auditor assigned to retail, catering, storage, packaging, or multi-site operations. Version 7 makes that expectation clearer by tying competence more closely to the scheme structure and the updated PRP framework. For organizations, this means auditor training is no longer just a mandatory annual activity. It is part of competence management. You need to be able to show that your internal auditors understand the correct scheme version, the applicable PRPs, the scope of the site, and the way evidence should be evaluated. If your current internal audit team was trained on older clause references, that training should now be refreshed. The audit checklist should also be reviewed to ensure it reflects the ISO 22002-X series and the updated category applicability. In version 7, competence is not static. It must match the current scheme, the current scope, and the current risks. To summarize, Module 2 of FSSC 22000 version 7 brings a broad set of changes that affect general requirements, prerequisite programs, laboratory control, emergency procurement, specifications, food defense, food fraud, allergen management, culture, transport, packaging, food loss and waste, multi-site control, and internal auditor competence. Some clauses were clarified, some were updated, and some were completely reshaped to reflect the new scheme architecture. The key message is that organizations should not treat these updates as isolated edits. They should be seen as a connected system of requirements that influence how the organization operates, verifies, documents, and improves its food safety management system. If your manuals, procedures, checklists, and training records still reflect version 6 terminology, they should be reviewed and revised in a structured way. A successful transition depends on 3 things: understanding the changes, updating the system, and proving implementation through evidence. Once those 3 elements are in place, the organization is in a much stronger position for audit readiness and long-term compliance. The upcoming section of the training will focus on the specific FSSC 22000 additional requirements found within Part 3, which details the mandatory protocols for the certification process. We will specifically examine how version 7 updates the framework for scheme requirements, the calculation of audit durations, and the governance of multi-site certifications.